Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. So, if you have been following our lectures, we ended the last lecture with the notion that now functional brain studies have found dedicated brain networks for religious belief and spiritual exercise or spiritual activity. And here's yet another paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences called Cognitive and Neural Foundations of Religious Belief. And I'll quote from that paper, based on the above psychological structure, we hypothesize that religious belief relates to specific patterns of brain activation. So again, what the science is now showing is that there are dedicated brain networks for the religious experience. Does this mean that there's a specific spot in the brain that's devoted to religion and only to religion, the way that there's a speech center in the brain? No. But what it means is that the brain uses parts that it sometimes uses on other activities, but it connects them and relays them and networks them in a very specific way in the religious exercise, so that there are truly dedicated brain networks for religiosity. Let me give you an example. We have the same genes in every cell of our body. Yet, some cells are liver cells, and some cells are, for example, brain cells. How is it that cells that carry the same genetic information on our 46 chromosomes are so different? Well, it is because of the way we activate some genes and suppress others. And that network of gene activation makes one cell a liver cell, while another cell turns into a brain cell, while another into a heart cell, a blood cell, a bone cell, and so forth. And so the brain uses dedicated portions that are involved in emotion, that are involved in cognition, that are involved in belief, that are involved in spatial awareness, and so on, and melds them into a specific and dedicated network that is the brain, we don't want to say brain center, but the brain network for spirituality and religious belief. And so this is now what science is finding, once again supporting, at least in my mind, that religiosity is innate. And the question now becomes, how have these findings been interpreted? Well, in this book, for example, The God Part of the Brain, on the website for it, this instinct to believe is the result of an evolutionary adaptation, a coping mechanism that emerged in our species to help us survive our unique and otherwise debilitating awareness of death. So surprisingly, among some scientists, not all scientists by any means, but among some scientists, their interpretation of finding dedicated brain networks for spirituality is that this must be an evolutionary adaptation to help us cope with the notion that we're going to die. Because it would be depressing for us to realize that we're just going to live and die and turn into dust and this life is pretty meaningless. We have somehow evolved this brain network to make up the notion of God, make up religiosity and spirituality as a comfort or coping mechanism. And I myself am rather surprised that some scientists have taken this interpretation. It is, of course, a reflection of their underlying non-belief in God. So if that is the assumption that you begin with, this would be how you interpret the findings. However, when we look at brain areas that activate in sight, in the visual experience, we know that there are dedicated brain areas for sight. We've already talked about them when we talked about functional imaging. We also know that there are dedicated brain areas for hearing and understanding. And we see that the Quran is telling us in Surah Al-Mulk, قُلْ هُوَ الَّذِي أَنْشَأَكُمْ وَجَعَلَ لَكُمُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ قَلِيلًا مَا تَشْكُرُونَ. He it is who has brought you into being and has given you hearing and sight, and has given you hearts to think and understand. How seldom do you give thanks? Now, when I see a dedicated brain area for the visual experience, do I then assume that what this does is produce hallucinations? Or do I assume that, or the brain area for hearing, do I then assume that this is a coping mechanism to make up sounds? Or do I assume that light and visual stimuli exist, and therefore the brain is equipped with an inherent mechanism that is God-given, and that sounds exist, and the brain is equipped with an inherent mechanism to process visual and auditory information? So why is it that when it comes to a religious or spiritual network, instead of concluding that I have a vision area, therefore visual stimuli must exist, or I have an auditory area, therefore sounds and auditory stimuli must exist, why is it that when we see a religious center or religious network, we say, oh, well, this must be an evolutionary mechanism to help people cope so that they can make up, astaghfirullah, a God? Let me give you a more specific example. In an area of the brain called the hypothalamus, a portion of it called the lateral hypothalamus is the hunger center. And an area in the brain that is just behind the sensory cortex of the parietal lobe and just above the temporal lobe is known as the gustatory cortex. This is the area that processes taste. Now, think of a baby in the womb. This baby is not eating. This baby is being given all of its nutrition through the mother's umbilical cord. Yet, as this baby's brain is developing, it is developing a lateral hypothalamic nucleus that will become its hunger center, and it is developing a gustatory cortex that will allow it to taste its food when it's born. And indeed, as soon as a baby is born, very shortly thereafter, it starts to cry because it wants to be fed, because this hunger center is now activating, and it is able to taste its food. And when you give a baby something that they're not used to, they reject it because they've gotten used to a certain taste like mother's milk. So if I were an alien who knew nothing about humans but could decipher neuroanatomy and studied the brain of an in utero baby, a baby in the mother's uterus, and found a hunger center and found a taste center, what would my logical conclusion be? My logical conclusion would be that there is such a thing as food, and that this food has such a thing as taste. Different foods have different tastes. Would I conclude that these areas of the brain are present to allow the baby to imagine the process of eating and imagine that food has taste? No, I would conclude that they are there to reflect a reality that the brain will encounter. And to me, I interpret the findings in neurotheology exactly in the same way. That if we are being asked to recognize the existence of God and to engage in worship and to engage in spirituality, it would only make sense that our brain would be equipped to do so with dedicated networks. And when we look at Surah Al-Rum, we see the Quran is telling us, فَأَقِمْ وَجْهَكَ لِلدِّينِ حَنِيفًا فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا لَا تَبْدِيلَ لِخَلْقِ اللَّهِ ذَلِكَ الدِّينُ الْقَيِّمُ وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. And so set thy faith steadfastly toward the one ever true faith, turning away from all that is false. That is the best translation of Hanif. In accordance with the natural disposition which God has instilled into man. فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا. The Quran is telling us that practice the true faith and that this is in accordance with the natural disposition which has been instilled into us. And do not allow any change to corrupt what God has created. So I interpret this verse as, again, extremely strong evidence for the innateness of religiosity and faith and recognition of the existence of God. The Quran is telling us this is the natural disposition that God has instilled into human beings. Science seems to be telling us the same thing. And I am extremely surprised that some scientists, now that we have found neural networks specifically dedicated to the experience of religiosity, choose instead to interpret this as some sort of coping mechanism. Different than interpreting all of the other neural networks that we discover for other things. And we see the same message in the hadith. I won't quote the entire hadith, but this is a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, where the Prophet, peace be upon him, is saying that مَا مِن مَوْلُودٍ إِلَّا يُولَدُ عَلَى الْفِطْرَةِ, that there is not a person except that he is born in the natural state of surrender to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, this would make perfectly logical sense, that if we are being asked to recognize the existence of God, to feel the spiritual experience, to surrender ourselves onto Him, that we would be equipped with the brain capacity to do so. So bees, for example, need to go to certain flowers to get the nectar, to make honey, and in the process help an indispensable function of pollinating those plants. So when we look at this flower, this is what we see. Bees, however, have a visual apparatus construction that allows them to see into the ultraviolet spectrum that is invisible to us. And this is the way the flower would look to a bee, this exact same flower. Again, this is the way the flower looks to us. This is the way the flower looks to the bee. Why? Because these different appearances send different signals to bees. We don't need this sort of finesse distinction because our role vis-a-vis these flowers is different than the bee's role vis-a-vis these flowers. And if we were to ask dogs to learn to play chess, we know that human beings can learn to play chess very well. They can beat almost the most powerful computers. Until very recently, the wonderful chess champion Kasparov lost to Deep Blue. But there's no doubt about the fact that a human being has been equipped with neural networks in the brain that allow them to master the game of chess. Dogs have not. So would it be fair or reasonable to ask dogs to play chess when they have no neural network for chess? Of course not. And would it be reasonable to expect human beings to recognize the existence of God, to indulge in the spiritual activities that we take part in, to feel a sense of self-surrender and to feel the awe of the divine creation, when we do not have a brain capacity or network to do that? Of course, that wouldn't make sense. And I myself am very heartened in terms of my faith by these latest scientific findings. And I hope that you have found this information new and interesting. And I hope that you, at least in part, would agree with some of my conclusions. We're not nearly done yet. There's a lot more interesting stuff to come, inshallah. So please continue to share with us and join in the next lecture. Assalamu alaikum.